Hi folks, so yesterday I put up a video about how to grip a longsword, and keeping it short and sweet, I explained that essentially there are two basic ways that you see the longsword gripped in the Middle Ages and early Renaissance. One is with the hands together essentially between the crossguard and the pommel, and the other one is actually with a gap between the hands gripping the pommel. Okay, and each of these have their exponents. Some people prefer one, some people prefer the other. What I should add to that is there's actually a lot more detail to gripping the longsword. So there are other ways you can grip it. The first thing I should mention is whether you've got the hands apart or the hands together, and both are shown in German sources. Something that's very, very common in the Lichtenau lineage is actually using the thumb on the underneath flat of the blade, like that, to actually steer the blade in certain motions, like the Zwerchau type sort of twisting cuts, sometimes known as the helicopter of death. This is a particularly German thing. I've looked in non-German treatises for it and artwork, and you don't really see it much outside of the German Lichtenau tradition as far as I can see. You see it in the Netherlands and in other areas that were affected by German longsword fencing, Belgium and so on, but you don't really see it in Italian sources or English or French sources. And this relates to a topic I'll talk about in a later video to do with the guard positions and the way that the sword is moved as well. So that's the first thing to note, is that the thumb on the flat of the blade, and in the guard positions as well, like Flug and Ox, is a very German thing, but it is done very commonly in the late 14th to mid or late 16th century, potentially into the 17th century as well. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing to say is that the sword, this type of sword, the longsword, was very often used in one hand alone, and that could be either hand. So usually in a source like Fiore, for example, you'll see there are movements coming in close where the left hand will come away from the sword, come away from the pommel end of the sword, and you'll do things with the left hand. It might be striking, pushing, moving it in for a throw, arm wrapping, grabbing the other person's weapon, all of these sort of things with the left hand. And while you're doing that, your longsword essentially becomes a one-handed sword while you're doing that. And usually, in Fiore at least, when you're doing something with the left hand, you bring the point online and you're using it as a stabbing sword with one hand. Obviously in close-in distance, close range, gioco stretto, using the point makes a lot of sense because it requires fairly little movement and motion and pressure to wound the enemy, and you can do it repeatedly, very easily, which is very good when you're in close and you've got a hold on someone. And equally, it doesn't create openings. When you lift the sword to cut, that would be an opportunity for the opponent to close in on you, for example, or grab your sword blade. By keeping the point online, you're keeping them at bay at the same time as stabbing them. So the sword, and not just in Fiore but in German sources as well, is very often used as a one-handed sword, and that's why this is often known as a hand and a half sword, because you can use it in one hand. The other time when you might use it one-handed is on horseback, because riding, generally speaking, you're holding the reins with your left hand, and it makes a lot more sense to use a sword one-handed than it does two-handed on horseback. There are a few, I found literally a handful of original medieval images showing the sword being used two-handed on horseback, so it did happen. However, those tend to be sort of heroic or biblical scenes, you know, like the four horsemen of the apocalypse sort of thing. So maybe it's a degree of exaggeration. I think generally speaking, the longsword was used one-handed from horseback, and of course then you can steer your horse better because you can hold the reins as well as steering with your knees. So the longsword was often used as a one-handed sword when in close grappling or when on horseback. The other way you sometimes see it gripped is actually with the rear hand, which is usually the left hand, because a right-handed person has the right hand at the top and the left hand at the bottom. Left-handed person is the opposite. with the rear hand actually to usually give thrusts, very occasionally perhaps a one-handed cut. However, although this has become fashionable in some tournaments to give a one-handed cut because it's a way of tagging the opponent from a long distance away, historically it would be very hard to keep the edge aligned doing it with one hand with the left hand, because you can't really feel the edge alignment very well in your left hand at the pommel end. Whereas you can with the top hand, because your thumb is against the side of the cross, you can feel which direction the edge is in. So usually it's more practical if you're going to do that to give a thrust, because the thrust doesn't need edge alignment, the point just needs to go into the opponent. And so for a long distance attack, if someone's expecting you to give a cut and you do one of these long thrusts holding with the sword at the back of the pommel, at the end of the hilt, you're essentially extending your reach. And you can lance out that thrust. Obviously you have to be wary with it, because having done it, boom, if you miss or if the opponent parries, they're now going to try and hit you back. And you've got to quickly get that sword back into two hands, because you can't really use a real longsword with any dexterity at all holding it by this end. You're quite disabled for a second whilst you get your sword back into two hands again. So it's a risky move, but it often pays off to tag the opponent. So in short, you can hold the sword with either hand remaining on the hilt whilst releasing the other one. And the final thing to mention, which I'm sure all of you know all about anyway, is half swording, which I've mentioned before, which is of course another way that you can use the longsword. But I'm not going to talk much about half swording now, because I'll do another video about half swording at some point. So there we go, there are other ways to hold the sword. One final thing I should mention, the thumb up thing. I said that it only appears in German sources. This is generally speaking true. However, I have noted over my years working with Italian sources that occasionally in parrying motions, in the illustrations it looks like the thumb is up. I personally do this when I parry with the longsword, because when the opponent's blade comes down here, if you keep the thumb down, you often get hit on the end of your thumb there if you don't have a wide ricasso like on a feather. But by sticking your thumb up, you essentially hide the thumb behind the blade, and their blade can't contact with your hand. And if you look in Vardi and Marozzo, for example, this appears in parrying-like motions, the thumb appears to be up. And note it's not the same as the German thumb flat on the blade to steer the edge. It's just simply sticking up, and I think this is a way of hiding the thumb behind the blade to protect it during parrying motions. So there we go. There's a lot more that could be said about holding the longsword, but there's a few more things to think about. Thank you.